That didn't sound. Any sound coming out of me? Any amplification?
Yes.
Welcome to you all. It's our pleasure, as I say, seeing you here tonight. Great to see such a turnout. Blessed again with good weather. Thank you. Our host, our guide tonight is Peter Mint.
And your host is Catherine Kingan, who's over there.
Our host is Catherine over there. I'm not sure which one, but there was a great disowning of responsibility there. But thank you very, very much for hosting us here tonight. As I say, we're delighted to be here. We're looking forward to learning all about it. And already the scenery is so very pleasing. Great. We'll move forward then, because immediately I'll pass it over to Peter here and he will take us forward. Thank you, Peter.
This feels like Men in Black or a science fiction movie. You're all very welcome here this evening. I have to apologise, I had a couple of tractors and trailers I was hoping to take you around the estate on, but I just didn't get time to pull them together, so it's Shanks's pony for us all this evening. I'm just going to start very briefly by telling you about where we are at the moment, and then talk a little bit about where we're standing, and we'll move on. Tynan Abbey is owned by the Stronge family. Catherine and her cousin James are Stronges. It's been in their family since about the 1700s. At the moment, the estate comprises of about 850 acres. There's 250 acres of woodland and about 500 acres of grassland that we're farming ourselves. It's right next, as I'm sure a lot of you know, to Caledon Estate, which is in Tyrone. We're in Armagh, and we're touching Castle Leslie and Monaghan, and it's quite unique in that respect, in the three estates all touch in different counties. And at the peak of their activities, there was about 70,000 acres covered by the three of them in this area. Tynan Abbey tended to extend north towards Benburb and south towards Middletown, out towards Armagh. Castle Leslie obviously down south towards Monaghan, and then Caledon was heading off towards Dungannon. And that's probably why when you pass through this area, whether you go into Castle Leslie for a meal or whatever, why there's so much beautiful woodland in the area. It's all estate woodland. Caledon is about 3,000 acres, and like I was saying, we're about 850. Where we're standing at the moment is called the Gun Park. This was created by the Americans during World War II. The American 2nd Division came here. The 34th Regiment of the 2nd Division were based here. They came here in January 1943. They cleared this area, and I'll show you some photographs later on of all the artillery, which is why it's called the Gun Park, lined up here. And there's also some great photographs of them playing baseball in this field here. Baseball was a theme that carried right through the war with the 2nd Division, but I'll tell you more about that later. The buildings here, you'll also see a photograph of them playing baseball with those buildings in the background. They were the engineering huts for their machinery. The other point of note, when you drove in through the gate, you might have seen an old gate lodge, a derelict gate lodge. That was designed by a guy called John Nash. Some of you might know John Nash. He was responsible for Buckingham Palace, most of Regency London. He designed Regent Street and anything with which you're familiar in London. He started out his career doing follies, gate lodges, etc., and then obviously progressed to be one of Britain's greatest architects of the age. He was actually here in Armagh to design Caledon House, which is about half a mile in that direction. Just while we're on the subject of gate lodges, I don't know if any of you ever go to Castle Leslie, but on the road between here and Castle Leslie, there's another derelict gate lodge. When the Americans were here for their duration, two ladies of the night who were sisters rented that and entertained the entire division for 8 months. They were that popular that there was an armed guard placed on the door to regulate who came and went. When the Americans left, they were very tired. I mean the girls, not the Americans. But with the proceeds of their 6 months' work, they bought themselves a farm and a lot of cushions to sit down on. So if you're ever passing that way, keep your eye out for that den of iniquity. We'll wander on now. If those of you would like to drive, just drive up to the top, to the yard there, and turn left, or just follow us very slowly. So if we all want to wander on now towards the Abbey.
Yeah, we did pick a good evening for this.
Oh, it's unbelievable. I'll just wait. I just want to have a quick
Nature's wouldn't pick all of them.
I know, that's what I never really them.
Oh, you do it if you see them.
Stopped here. I mentioned earlier on the trees in the area. There are a group, the Tree Society of Ireland, who basically go around basically deciding what tree is a specimen tree and what isn't. Between them, Tynan, Caledon and Castle Leslie have quite a large number of specimen trees. The one that you see here on your left is one of them. It's an oak tree, as you can obviously tell. Its circumference is about, I think it's about 12.5 meters at the base. I'll show you a couple more as we go along, but it is definitely the trees that are the making of Tynan Abbey.
Hello. Hello.
Oh,
Good man, good man. So we've got a few more show coaches coming here. Oh, there's the girls following, yeah.
There it is.
Yeah.
Tynan or man and see if it run away, run around after the Second World War, you wouldn't know what.
Bored of this, Helena?
I am, of course you.
Brilliant.
Brilliant evening for it too, isn't it?
Here, look at that part of my screen is blocked out, isn't it?
Oh.
just stopped here. This is the last remaining remnant of the American base from the war. This was the Navy hut, Navy, Air Force, Army hut where they came to get their post, flags, and everything, chocolate, all the things they really needed. So we have photographs of them queuing, actually barging to get into that hut, and obviously there's another one just behind you. One of the legacies of them being here is that the estate is littered with the bases, paths, and also the foxholes that they dug and never really filled in properly, which we tend to bounce over on the tractors on a regular basis. But I just thought you might be interested to see the last of the Nissen huts.
Dr. Marshall, say hello.
No, I don't recognize it.
I know you don't, that's why I do it. Yeah.
Back to trees again. This is an ash tree that you'd see here, obviously. This is actually the second biggest ash tree in Ireland in terms of circumference. It's 17.5 meters around the base. It used to be the third biggest, and the biggest one was here, and then the biggest one fell down, and now it's the second biggest. That is planted about 250 years ago, so around about the American Declaration of Independence. The other thing to note about the ash is both the Celts and the Scandinavians 1,000 years ago, everybody thought that the hawthorn here is a fairy tree and the oak is a mighty tree. The tree that everybody venerated most was the ash. The ash was the connection between heaven and hell. Yggdrasil, it was the ladder to heaven, as well as providing virtually everything you needed in terms of construction and day-to-day tools. But the ash tree was the most venerated tree in this country and in Scandinavia. I'm afraid I provided this fail. I wasn't sure how many people were coming, so you're going to have to punch up of who sits where. I suppose young ones keep standing. If you want to grab a seat, I'll go through all these pictures in turn, and then you can come up and have a better look later on. The odd time I've given this talk, rapidly becoming apparent that I think a lot of you know a hell of a lot more.
Sorry, can you turn the thing
sorry.
around?
Yeah.
That's it.
A hell of a lot more than I do. Most of the time, people have quite a sparse knowledge of the history of Ulster. So some of this stuff, you'll go, oh my God, you know, I know all this. But some people are here who don't, who are not a member of the society. And if I get my facts wrong and I say the last giant died of hunger in 1740, and you guys say no, it was 1753, don't let the truth get in the way of a good story. We'll wind the clock back late 1500s to the 9 Years' War. The plantation of Munster and the plantation of Leinster had already taken place. It was fairly straightforward for the plantation down there, mainly because they were used to an English presence through Strongbow and the Normans from hundreds of years beforehand. The gent at the top left corner of these pictures was Hugh O'Neill. Hugh O'Neill, as you know, was the Earl of Tyrone, came from Dungannon. And initially he was actually loyal to Elizabeth I. He grew up in the court over in England, and she was a great fan of his, and he was very charismatic, a great soldier, and very popular in the court over in England. He was supportive of her down in Munster, and then as English eyes turned towards Ulster, he rapidly realised that he was on the wrong side from his own perspective. A lot of people say, well, why did the plantation take place? At the time, the population of England was 4.1 million. Elizabeth had her eyes fixed on the Spanish, the French, she had the Scots to the north, and Ireland was in her back door. Population of Ireland at the time was only 1.5 million, and there were about 150 warring factions at the time. She was worried about an invasion through the back door, and therefore, amongst other reasons, started the plantation. Hugh O'Neill, when he decided to go against her, he started the 9 Years' War. Great military tactician, as you all know. He won the Battle of the Yellow Ford, the Battle of Clontibret, when he ambushed English forces on the way to Monaghan, near here, to relieve the garrison at Monaghan. But after the 9 Years' War, this was basically where we're standing, was no man's land between Hugh O'Neill up in Dungannon and Mountjoy, who finally managed to establish a presence in Charlemont Fort over in the Moy. Some of you who are up from Dublin will know Mountjoy through the fact that his soul, the only thing they did to honour him was to name a prison after him down in Dublin that's full of scangers. The thing I like about Hugh O'Neill was two things. I think Elizabeth must have been slightly perplexed by the individual she met. She liked Hugh O'Neill. And then she met Grace O'Malley. I don't know if you know of Granuaile. Granuaile was a pirate queen off the coast of Clare. She had several run-ins with the governor of Ireland, and finally she'd had enough. Very charismatic and beautiful woman again. So she had a small fleet of boats, and she sailed one of them around the south coast of Ireland, around the south coast of England, up the Thames, and parked it outside the Tower of London. I said, I want to see Elizabeth, your governor's really pissing me off. Elizabeth kept her waiting for a few days, and after a few days she said, I might meet this lady, she sounds like quite a strong character. So she was admitted to Elizabeth's presence, and the two of them got on like a house on fire. Granuaile couldn't speak English, and Elizabeth couldn't speak Irish, so they conversed in Latin. They became that friendly. Elizabeth had a cold, and she had a little lace handkerchief up her sleeve that she blew her nose in, and Granuaile was disgusted, and she took it and threw it in the fire and said, that's not how you get rid of a cold. She spat in the fire and said, that's what you got to do. So Elizabeth said, look, you've been raiding a lot of our ships, but we hate the Spanish. Just raid the Spanish and we'll call it quits and let her on her way. The other interesting fact about Hugh O'Neill is that unlike Elizabeth, as we all know, who died childless, Hugh O'Neill died leaving 5 children. One of his children, Sarah, married a guy called McGuinness, who was the first Earl of Iveagh. They had a daughter, who had a daughter, who had a son, who had a daughter, who had a daughter, who had a son, who had a daughter, who had a son, who had a daughter, and her name was Elizabeth II. So it's funny how life works. Anyway, so after the flight of the Earls, a guy called Cowell, Robert Cowell, came to live here. A bit like Charles Poyntzpass, he was a lieutenant in the Elizabethan army. At the time, there were 18,000 soldiers stationed in Ulster. Half of them were Catholic, half of them Protestant. And although this was at the time of James I, The English treasury was bust, and they were also having trouble elsewhere, and they needed to get the army disbanded. They left 1,500 men in plantation houses dotted around Ulster to keep an eye on things. Cowell was given a parcel of land which was 4 billabos. Now, a billabo was approximately 60 acres, and 60 acres was supposed to maintain 2 families. And you go, Jesus, how would 60 acres would maintain 10 families? But we have to remember that the area around here was very heavily wooded. It wasn't the arable pastoral landscape that we see today. This at one stage was the most heavily wooded island or country in Europe. And now the only country in Europe with less trees is Iceland. We've completely denuded our landscape here. Cowell settled down with his 4 billabos. Now in Armagh, because the ground wasn't as good, a billabo was actually 100 acres. The first thing he did was chop down trees, and this is what everybody did. Basically, the main income you needed before you cleared the land was to create charcoal to produce iron ore. What you could tell by I think in 1620, 32,000 tons of iron ore were exported to Scotland from Ulster because of the charcoal that was produced. At the time it was pretty insecure, despite the fact he'd been given the land. We are actually currently in the barony of Tyranny. Different baronies were settled by different religions, so some were Presbyterian, some were Protestant, some were Catholic. This was a mixed barony. There were 7 English landowners and there were 17 Catholic landowners, and they seemed to rub along fairly well. A lot of them Robert and Anne had 2 children, and their daughter married a guy called Hugh Eklund, and this is where Poyntzpass comes into the story. Eklund was the son of the Bishop of Conor and Down, and his father was on the way to a meeting in Dublin when he was murdered at Poyntzpass on the way down. You dirty bugger. Anyway, despite that, the Eklunds settled down and they continued to grow. The Eklund was originally from Fifeshire and County Down, and there was a relative period of calm and prosperity. So if you look at the customs duties in 1632, for Ulster as a whole, there were £22,000 at the time. By 1640, they'd gone up to 51,000. Most of that, like I was saying, was through iron ore. The interesting thing, like I was saying about the timber, the next townland along is a place called Bondville, and the owner was a guy called Bond. He was an absentee landlord, and he kept noticing that all his timber was going missing. So he contacted the magistrates and said, "Look, they're taking all my timber." And the magistrate said, "Who?" And he said, "Everyone." And what was happening was on a Saturday and a Sunday, 200 or 300 people were going at a time, and just chopping the trees down. You couldn't arrest everybody. The picture that you see underneath Hugh O'Neill is a map of Armagh, a picture drawn by a guy called Bartlett. In 1630, Bartlett came through and he started to map Ulster. And some of the earlier maps from 1600, you'll see Mayo to the north, Kildare to the south. Everything's turned through 90 degrees. As you can see, you probably can't see from where you're standing. When you come and have a look later, all the roofs are missing from the churches and the houses. This is because during the 9 Years' War, when Hugh O'Neill was fighting the English, Armagh was sacked 4 times by both sides. There was virtually nothing left. Even by 1640, the population of Armagh town was only 400 people. Most of them tradesmen, blacksmiths, cobblers, candle makers. There was a pound savers and a Chinese takeaway. Bartlett made his way through Ulster and up to Donegal. Everyone in Donegal knew their way around Donegal, and they said, if you need to make a map of Donegal, you shouldn't be here. And Bartlett's life came to a bloody and abrupt end. Life carried on until 1641. Eklund's son took on and expanded Eklund's son took on and expanded the farm and the estate here until 1641, when Phelim O'Neill, who lived just up the road, decided it was time to kick off again. It was kind of like a perfect storm. At the time, in the entire island of Ireland, there were only 800 English soldiers based to cover the entire nation. There'd been a famine in 1638, 1639, and everyone was pretty desperate. Phelim O'Neill took the opportunity to make the most of this, and one of the very first places he came was here. He hung Eklund and his son, who was 6 years old, and then anybody who worked or had helped them was drowned in the Core River about a quarter of a mile away. 6 months later, they found his other son, and they were drowned with 30 more people in the core. Now, this also happened over quite close to you at Jarrett's Pass. 40 people were drowned there. The reason I know this is that, moving the clock forward, when Cromwell came through in 1646 with his Christian version of the Taliban, he basically did a thing called the Down Survey, which is very interesting. He took depositions from everybody who'd had something done to them. Now, all of them were Protestant. Cromwell had no time for the Presbyterians, and obviously he had no time for the Catholics. So it was a very unfair and one-sided deposition. But from a historical perspective, what he did was he marked down on a map every single atrocity that had happened. And this is how I know. If you look up the Down Survey on the internet, Trinity College Dublin have layered it over a contemporary map of Ulster and put a red dot with who was killed, by whom, on what date. And Jarrett's Pass is the nearest one to all of you. So if you happen to be looking at the internet one evening, it's quite an interesting map. Things even then were still pretty unstable. If a wood cutting party went out, they didn't go out in less than a group of 12 to 15 people. The fuse, as you probably know, between Armagh and Newton Hamilton was still harbouring a lot of malcontents who used to make it their business to try and exploit weak situations. It's ironic, actually, that the wood chopping parties were ambushed like that. If you look at later settlement of America, when North Dakota, South Dakota, the Sioux and the Cheyenne were fighting the Americans, there was a trail called the Bozeman Trail. It was north of the Oregon Trail, and there's a thing called the Bozeman Massacre. When the Indians killed the cavalry, it was a massacre. When the cavalry killed the Indians, it was a battle. That particular day, a wood chopping party of 130 members of the cavalry who were building a fort nearby were ambushed, and they were all killed. I just found it interesting in that the only person they didn't scalp was the bugler. He fought with his bugle, or maybe he played some really bad tunes and scared them off, I don't know. But they left him intact. At the end of the 10 years until that war, there were only 50,000 people left in Ulster. And again, Poyntzpass comes up in the story, in that there were a number of incidents of cannibalism, most of them out near your neck of the woods. I'm going to count on my fingers and toes when I leave this evening. Not only was there a lot of hunger, the whole of society had been disrupted. The one animal that thrived, as you see in the picture up there, was the wolf, the Irish wolf. The Irish wolf is the same size as Canadian timber wolf. They were huge. The numbers went through the roof. Attacks on livestock and on people increased exponentially. And so every county in Ulster and in the south was left with 2 huntsmen and 24 wolfhounds on 24-hour standby. To put the value of a wolf pelt in context, they were traded at the Bristol docks at £6 a pelt. Now, this compared to if you captured a Catholic teacher, it was £10. A Catholic priest was £15, and a Catholic bishop was £20. These were all sent off as indentured labour to the West Indies, where they suddenly realised that red-headed, freckledy fellas didn't work too well out in the heat. And so they decided to go for slavery in other quarters. Bear with me. I think it's also worth noting that the reason why there was so much chaos in that 10-year period is that at the same time that Phelim O'Neill kicked off here, the English Civil War started. As a result of that, you had a Catholic army who suddenly became parliamentarian and royalist, a Protestant army who became parliamentarian and royalist, and same with the Presbyterians. And basically you had people who previously fought against each other now fighting together, and it was utter mayhem. At the end of the 10 years, bearing in mind the population 30 years earlier was 1.4 million, 500,000 indigenous people were killed and 120,000 English settlers. There were very few people left alive. To make matters worse, in this area, in 1660, as part of the retribution for what had gone on, they introduced the Navigation Act. Now, are there any farmers here this evening? Oh Jesus, most of this is agricultural. One of the main, apart from the timber and the charcoal, one of the main sources of income was cattle in Ulster, and always had been. Interestingly, as I'm sure you all know, 1,000 years earlier, the culture of cattle was almost identical to the Maasai in Kenya. They lived on the blood, the milk, and the meat, and that was just about it. They're transhumants, a lot of nomadic lifestyles. And this was one of the elements that made it difficult for the Vikings to come and conquer Ireland. There was nothing to conquer. Unlike other countries where they would take Paris or they take York in England, there were no towns. This brings me on to the Vikings. In 848, a guy called Torgeis, a Norwegian Viking, came to Ireland and he landed at what is now Dublin. He started Wood Quay, which some of you may have heard of. Founded Dublin, and then he said, I need to get to some of these monasteries, I need the booty. He went to Clonmacnoise, he sacked Clonmacnoise and went home a happy man. What he really wanted to do was hit Armagh. He knew that was the mother lode, so he came back with 60 longships. He landed at Newry, very close to all of you, as you know, made his way across country to Armagh, and killed about 1,000 monks on the way. Now, a lot of you are going, how did he find 1,000 monks? But at the time, there were 150 kings in Ireland. Each king had 2 bishops, and each bishop had 100 monks. There were monks everywhere. He got to Armagh, and he sacked it, and he couldn't believe what he'd found. He fell in love with the daughter of a local chieftain. He said, I'm going to make myself king of Ireland. He went to a local lake where he was ambushed and killed, and with a Viking army, you cut the head off the snake, and they just move on and become another army elsewhere. Word got back to Scandinavia that Armagh was fantastic. It was sacked 3 times in 1 month. First by the Norwegians, it was like Ibiza for them. Then the Swedes came, and then the Danes. They loved it. As a result, Armagh has the distinction of being one of the most sacked cities in Europe. I think it was sacked 10 times. A little aside is that what I like, there's a little story down in Glendalough, down in Wicklow. They were sacking Glendalough down at the same time. In a fjord called Roskilde in the north of Denmark, in the 1950s, fishermen started pulling up bits of timber from the bottom of the fjord. It's more of a harbour rather than a fjord. They didn't know what it was. They thought it was a medieval trading vessel. They sent divers down and they found 3 Viking longships that had been scuttled side by side in a war with the Norwegian Vikings. They did, over 10 years, they did a dendrochronological analysis of the biggest of the warships, and it turned out to be made from Wicklow oak. So they basically realised that the Vikings got to Glendalough, got the booty, got the slaves, and a bit like the famous line in Jaws, they said, we're going to need a bigger boat. That was what the boat was. They rebuilt a new boat called the Sea Stallion along identical lines, sailed it, this is about 12, 15 years ago, sailed it around the north of Scotland, landed it in Dublin, outside Collins Barracks for a year, went on display, and then it went around the south of England and went home again. Coming back to closer to home, you'll see 3 pictures there, 2 torques above and below the picture of the wolf, and then a collection of torques and the picture in the middle. This goes back to Torgeis. In 1860, a member of the Stronge family was out for a walk. There was a Crannog, which is a fortified island on the lake just around the corner from here, you'll see when we go for a little walk later on. In the roots of the tree was that Viking hoard, and it's on display in the Armagh Museum. A sign of honour amongst a Viking warrior, instead of a medal, was a torque. It went around your wrist or your arm. Ironically, or interestingly, each piece weighs exactly the same. It was used as currency as well as a decorative item. The picture in the middle is just it's a pile of Elizabethan coins that Kate still has that were in the house. They actually burned and melted together in the fire in 1981, which I'll come on to later on. The other one is a James I coin and a Charles I coin that were knocking around the Abbey. A little side story going back to Eklund. I was chopping up the branch of an oak tree. I can't remember whether it was that there or over there. Out of the branch fell a musket ball. The musket ball, I thought, well, could have been from any time. There was a programme on Time Team, I don't know if you watched it, on Hugh O'Neill and the Hill of Dungannon, Hill of O'Neill. The very top picture is a dragoon. The very first pistol, it's like a miniature cannon. It weighs a bloody ton. It must have taken hours to load. This was found by a neighbour of ours, Cahill, out the back of Caledon in Glenarb. There was a ford that the British soldiers retreated across after the Battle of Benburb in 1645, and they were ambushed at the ford about a mile away. and cattle has dug them out of the bottom of the river. One is a cavalry spur that you can see on the bottom, and the top one is a dragoon. Anyway, it transpires that the bull that I dug out of the tree fitted the dragoon. The dragoon was first used in 1641. Eklund was killed and hung in 1641. So A, it tells you the age of the tree. Maybe it was used that day. Who knows? Moving on. Just give us a second here, just to gather my thoughts. The family settled on down, started raising cattle, and were prospering. But as part of retribution, also as a way of controlling all their colonies, the English government introduced the Navigation Act. It prohibited the export of any live animals, any raw materials to England. Basically what they're trying to do was protect their own producers, their own farmers. And the bottom fell out of the cattle market. And it has a little bit of a similarity to markets today and what we're doing in Europe, etc. As a result of that, in 1663, duty from exports from Ireland dropped from £200,000 to £20,000 in 1675, a period of quite a lot of poverty. What did they do? People like Eklund switched to sheep, and basically a lot of the Scots settlers moved in with sheep, and sheep tended to do well here for quite some time, until English wool merchants in the 1700s didn't like the quality of the Irish wool. It was better than the English wool, and they put in a tax of 4 shillings a pound of wool. The bottom fell out of the Irish sheep market. The next year, 20,000 Scottish settlers left for America, founded Virginia, Kentucky, etc. And that was all because of the single tax that was put on wool. Initially, tillage here in this area was very basic. It was done by attaching a wooden plough to the tail of an ass. It started to rise quite exponentially. 1672, there was about 500,000 acres around here in tillage, which employed hundreds of thousands of people. Interesting enough, again, down in some of the areas, they realized that if you had arable, it was so much of a better employer than livestock that if people tried buying livestock, they'd find their animals hamstrung the next morning by the locals. The locals wanted the employment. Moving back to here, Eklund's daughter Elizabeth, it tends to have been the female line that's tended to pass from one down the centuries here. Eklund's daughter Elizabeth married a guy called Captain Manson. He was a Presbyterian from County Down, and again the estate tended to expand. By 1695 it was about 1,500 acres. The interesting point here is that an English acre and an Irish acre were very different things. An English acre was about a quarter, about 25 to 30% smaller than an Irish acre. So if you're waiting for your single farm payment around here, you'd be gutted, you'd be getting 25% less. The other one was that an Irish mile was 27% longer than an English mile. And it tended to vary from county to county. Until 1828, and the standardisation through the Ordnance Survey, every county had a different mileage system. So when the song It's a Long Way to Tipperary was written in 1912, it might have been 750 miles from Kerry to Tipperary, but it might have been only 3 miles from Antrim to Kerry to Tipperary, in which case the lyrics would have been Tipperary is just down the road. Manson was on business up in Derry when the Siege of Derry kicked off, 1688. Anybody correct me there on the date? I made that one up. Lucky guess. And it was here that the Strongs come into the picture. James Strong was a settler on the banks of the Foyle. He was the Sheriff of Lifford, and he owned a lot of land, some of which is still known as Strong's Orchard up in Derry. He had the ignominy of being fired on while he was in the siege from his own orchard, and a couple of the cannonballs are still here at the Abbey as a memento to them firing on him from his own land. The Strongs originally came from Blackie Castle in Scotland, settled in Derry, and then basically Captain Manson, who was living here, they became great friends, probably talking about food. Food in Derry at the time was pretty scarce. Rat casserole was a shilling, and you could buy a mouse for 6p. The kids, Eleanor, who was Captain Manson's, and John Strong, became very friendly. They used to communicate by carrier pigeon from here up to Derry. John and Eleanor became married. John became the curate at Tynan Parish, and that's how the Strongs came to be at Tynan Abbey.
I beg your pardon?
Was this house here?
This house was, oh sorry, I beg your pardon. This is the original site of the plantation house. The original Elizabethan plantation house would have been in here. This is what Cowell built, and gradually the house was built on and built on through the generations. Again, mostly by the women. Eleanor Stronge, I'm jumping forward and I'm jumping about here, but Eleanor Stronge expanded it in 1750. And I think something I'd just better say is Tynan Abbey was never an abbey, it just looks like one. This is actually a townland. It was once called Fairview. This is the townland of Fairview, and it's got a fair view. It was then expanded again in 1845 and added on to. So we have a stone that was originally, or Kate, sorry, has a stone that was originally in the front of the house, but it was actually at the back of the hall back here as the house grew over the years. Living here, there was actually a famine in Scotland. We keep thinking of the Irish famine. The Scots suffered a fair bit as well. This is in 1695. That year 20,000 Scots arrived destitute from Scotland. The poor laws, this is interesting, this applied specifically to Tynan village, stated that if you had a local vagrant, he could stay. If a vagrant wasn't from the locality, he had to wear a yellow badge in the form of a star, and he could be beaten from the town with a stick. I don't know if this rings a bell with later history with any of you, but it's amazing that it was there in 1695. The other thing that tended to happen while Eleanor and John were here is that there was a burgeoning industry in spirits. We're moving forward to about 1724, and duty paid on spirits in 1724 was paid on 130,000 gallons of spirits, and 60 years later it was 9.6 million gallons of spirits. So the whiskey industry here went through the roof at that time. Interesting fact that you might not know is that prior to Prohibition, 97% of the world's whiskey was Irish and 3% was Scotch. Prohibition came along and two things happened. The Scots developed blended whiskey, and the Canadians, who had a large percentage of Scots Canadians, shipped all the whiskey to Canada and shipped it across the border, and American tastes in whiskey switched almost overnight from Irish to Scotch whiskey. Virtually every village and town in Ireland had a distillery in it in 1720. I had a son, Matthew. He married Elizabeth Powell, who was a local lady. Matthew became mayor of Liverpool, and his brother moved over there in 1768. And this is really where a lot of the Stronge's wealth expanded. The estate continued to grow, like I was saying, knocking on towards 20,000 acres. Because he was the mayor of Liverpool and a merchant, he kind of had his finger on the pulse of what was going on. At the time, England was at war with France. Any English ship could become a privateer. It was an old tradition going right back to Elizabeth. Go out and catch us a French ship and you can keep all the booty. Matthew Stronge's ships tended to be particularly good at the job, and he did well out of that. At the same time, Bristol and Liverpool were major shipping routes for slaves on the way to replace the freckly, red-headed people from this country. Matthew realized this. He became the first man to perfect the transport of slaves direct from Africa to America and bypassed England. He did this from Senegal to Savannah, Georgia. In the first year he did it with 18 slaves, and a year later 18,000 went. Each slave was worth £30,000 in today's money, so you're talking about 540 million a year. He had the ignominy. If you were a captain of a slave ship in those days, if you made 2 successful trips, you could retire. That was the level of the wealth that was going on. Interestingly enough, moving on to Limerick, Cork and other areas, as the colonies continued to expand, and as restrictions were placed on Irish agriculture, whether it was through tax on wool, on the Navigation Act, the Corn Laws, which again prohibited the export of wheat to England, in Ireland, they very quickly copped on to the idea of added value. Again, it's pertinent to today in the context of Europe, trade, globalization, etc. Down in the south, they rapidly became the best producers of salted butter, salted and barreled beef in the world. The Danes, the Dutch, the Germans, the French, the Spanish all tried to copy them, and nobody could compete, and they became major exporters to America. And then in return, some of the imports that came in naturally was tobacco, but another one was the colour indigo. Everyone here was mad for the colour blue. The entire nation was running around dressed like Smurfs. I noticed there's a lot of blue here this evening. Interestingly enough, later on, when the flax industry kicked off, again in about the late 1700s, there was a lot of flax grown in this particular area. Flax took over as the major export from Ulster to Britain, and 25% of all agricultural produce was flax. in return, moving the clock back between 1580 and 1700, the number of emigrants to Ireland, Ulster, and America was the same. Ulster was quite appealing. If you were a plantation owner and you came here, there was a ready supply of cheap and abundant labor. If you went to America and you built your farm, you were more likely to be stabbed and be scalped. The locals weren't too keen to work for you. It wasn't until 1700 that the numbers, and like I was saying, with things like the tax on wool, the numbers of people who left this country for America exceeded the numbers of immigrants coming in. The Stronges continue to thrive here and have been here ever since, like I was saying. Perhaps one of the most notable feature moving on to the Stronges in 1849 was the famine, obviously. And people often say, well, you know, what was the impact of the famine in different counties? Because people just assumed that it was the same across the board. At the time, there was a massive amount of arable being produced here in this country. There's something like 4.4 million acres of arable crops being grown. Today it's only 750,000. Massive. We were huge exporters of wheat and of oats. Oats, obviously, because the horse needed so much to produce. 2 acres was needed of oats was needed to feed 1 horse for a year. Armagh, as well, because of its flax production, the American Civil War was going on at roughly the same time, so the cotton industry in America bottomed out and the flax industry boomed here. So actually Armagh, relatively, during the famine, didn't do too badly. I'm going to fast forward the clock slightly to about 1845. Some of you may have noticed the front gate as you drove past on the way from Middletown. Those of you who got lost 2 or 3 times. That would be the picture that is just up there on the left. Elizabeth Calvert came and married James Stronge at the time. She was her brother, Kate. Was Kate here? Probably not. Her brother was on the staff of Wellington at Battle of Waterloo, and there's a diary excerpt that her mother wrote when she came to visit Tynan Abbey at the time, saying, "This is a kip." It was, the builders were in, the doors were off the bedroom, it was cold, it was windy, and she couldn't wait to go home. Isabella was actually a very progressive lady. Her husband, who was living here at the time, was the magistrate, and his job was to prevent the celebration of Mass on a Sunday. There was a Mass garden about 400 yards that direction before those trees grew, and he'd sit at his kitchen table every morning and his wife said to him, "This is crazy, you're facing away so you don't see Mass going on." And so they gave the ground for the chapel to be built up up just the other side of that hill, which at the time was a very progressive move on her behalf. When she moved in, most people when they move into a house want to change the kitchen. She wanted to change the front gate, so she was responsible for building the front gate. Moving on to about 1900, so James Henry Stronge here was at the time. He had to sell about 1,200 acres locally and 1,000 acres further afield because of the Wyndham Act, the Land Acts basically. During the period of the Land Acts, about 9 million acres had to be sold. This is how the concept of Conacre, I don't know if any of you have heard of Conacre, it's a rental system that you pay if you're renting land from another farmer. And the reason this was brought in, they suddenly realised if a tenant had the right to buy the land from his landlord, and he rented the ground to somebody else, that person would have the right to buy the land off him. And this put a break in the system to enable him to sublet without being forcibly forced to sell. Time moves forward and we move to more troubled times prior to World War I and the formation of the UVF. The photographs that you see beneath the Viking horde there, you'll see fellas sitting around a fire and a row of motorbikes. That was the dispatch corps of the UVF who came to try and train here at Tynan Abbey. I think it's a cracking photograph, as photographs go, of the motorbikes at the time. We then move on to World War I. There were 5 children at the time. James Stronge was the only male child, forgive me. That's Jim Stronge on the bottom left. He had 4 sisters whose names are written here. I can't remember because I only read the first half of the notes before I came out this evening. He was killed in World War One. He came home to marry his sweetheart, Winnie Alexander. I had a photograph here. Yeah, here he is. He came home to get married. This is him on leave with the Royal Irish Fusiliers. He came home for 2 weeks leave, got married, went back, and he was killed the next week by a piece of shrapnel through his head. Winnie Alexander became a nurse on the Western Front, as did Jim's sister, whose name was... Kate's not there. And then basically, come 1930, their father died. The photographs below are photographs from the nurses from the Western Front, of a hospital on the Western Front, and that photograph there is not a relation. I just love the photograph of a nurse having a fag and a quiet time. So this, four of the sisters, three of the sisters were married off, and this left Joy Stronge as the sole survivor here at Tynan Abbey. The pictures on your left-hand side came at partition. So in 1921, the RUC were based here at Tynan Abbey. You can see a Rolls-Royce armoured car, the top left, or middle left there, and you can see the policemen there, bottom left, guarding the Abbey. Joy was left in charge here. She fell in love with a member of the Royal Artillery called Major Fillory. Major Fillory was living here up the road in Auchnacloy for some time, but they left to start a new life in New Zealand. They were married in New Zealand and never came back. They created a farm out of the bush, and ironically it's all started by cutting the trees down, selling the trees for timber, exactly what they did 400 years earlier. As a result of that, there was a bit of a vacuum here. So Sir Norman Stronge, who some of you may have heard of, and his family came to caretake and look after Tynan Abbey. They were cousins of the family who came from came from Lizard Manor up in Derry, and they came down here in 1930. While they were here, World War II broke out, and like I was saying, the American 2nd Division came to stay here. The 34th Regiment were based here. That was 2,500 men. They went in on D-Day +1. This photograph that you see here is just around the corner of the fellas pushing the piano up the avenue to have a good time, and you can see the Nissan huts. This is roughly where your cars are parked at the moment. This photograph here is the 2nd Division coming across the bridge at Caledon. I don't know if any of you go through Caledon. That's the front entrance to Caledon Estate, and this is the old railway bridge. This is the old Clocker Valley Railway that went across here. This was taken just near the house where the ladies of the night had their place. These fellas are obviously in for a cup of tea afterwards. There's a lot of black market trading that went on across the border at the time. Here you'll see a photograph of them playing baseball. This is the field that I pointed out where we all met up earlier on this evening. And this is the gun park. This is exactly where your cars are parked at the moment. The 2nd Division, this is them playing baseball in front of those huts there. And what comes up throughout the pictures of the war, of the 2nd Division, is them playing baseball in their downtime. It was a big feature of their recreational time. The emblem of the 2nd Division is the Indian Head Division. You may have seen it in Saving Private Ryan, etc. In the film. They moved in on D-Day +1, and you think, oh, that's lucky people. They left here literally overnight. So if you imagine, there were 2,500 people here, but there are also more up at the vicarage, more in Caledon. And literally overnight they vanished. They went to Swansea, got on a boat, arrived on D-Day +1, like I was saying, and immediately got embroiled in the bocage. They took a hammering. They went through Normandy and ended up in the Battle of Ardennes. Hitler made one last counter push towards the end of the war. And it was actually the 2nd Division who were instrumental in holding the line, along with the 101st Parachute Regiment. They then moved into Czechoslovakia, and the 2nd Division were responsible for the liberation of Czechoslovakia. Today they are based on, and have been since the 1950s, on the Korean border in the 48th parallel, defending against any possible attack by North Korea. During the course of the war, a division is approximately 10,000 men. 18,000 men were killed or injured. Basically they replaced themselves 1.5 times. It was fairly hard going. After they left, the Belgian army came. When Eisenhower liberated Belgium, he got to Antwerp, and I don't know if any of you have seen Monty Python, but the Judean People's Front and the People's Front of Judea all stood up and said, "We're the official resistance." He said, "We're the official resistance," and he said, "Forget this, you're all going to Tynan Abbey, and we're going to train you to become a proper army." So this is the Belgians. Apparently they were very well received. The war was coming to an end. They knew they were safe. Very relaxed time was had by all. Time went by, so Norman was getting older, and the troubles began in the 70s, as you all know. 1981, Sir Norman was killed here at the Abbey. Ironically, the only thing left is the front door, and it was the front door that was blown in. He and his son Jim were killed. That was end of January 1981. You can see on the pictures, you can come and have a look at these obviously in a minute. This is the burnt out front of the Abbey the day after. And you can see the library windows literally the morning after the fire on the right hand side. The group who attacked here at the Abbey made their way back down the front avenue across the border to Monaghan and got away until they were ambushed at Loughall by the SAS about a year later. So that left the place, that left Sir Norman's two daughters, Evie and Daphne. Evie was married to a chap over in England, and Daphne was married to a chap called James Kingan over in Bangor, and she passed away there about 15 years ago. So now, like I was saying, the Abbey is owned by Joy Stronge's granddaughter, who left for New Zealand in 1930, and James Kingan, who was Sir Norman's grandson, and the two of them own and run Tynan Abbey together. That's a potted history of Tynan. There's 101 different stories. Just behind you, you'll see an oak tree that's slightly burnt. 1828, there was an agricultural show, a bit like Balmoral up in Tynan. A string quartet, and afterwards all the great and the good were invited to come and have a picnic here. A string quartet came to play, and they didn't know that they had to play from the top of the tree. They tied them up, and pinched them and tied them into the top, and there they had to play for the duration of the afternoon. I find when I first came up to Armagh, I knew very little of the history of Ulster, and I couldn't believe how much of Irish history has basically pivoted around the county of Armagh and Ulster, and how much Tynan Abbey had been caught up into it. It's not by any stretch of the imagination the most impressive estate or house that you would see, but the interesting thing is that by, I think it was 1970, only 25% of the large houses in Ireland were still owned and inhabited by their original owners. And I think that's what's perhaps unique about Tynan Abbey, is it's managed to stay in the family for so long. That's about it in a nutshell. If any of you have any questions, please feel free to ask.
It's a trivial question, I suppose, but all the Americans they had a marry local woman.
Yeah, they did. One or two did, yeah. And one of the two of them had kids but went home.
Has the owner considered here a golf course?
Offers were made, but no. If you'd like to go, I'll just take you down around the corner. You have to bear in mind Belfast didn't exist obviously at the time. Everybody went that direction. It's called Post Hill. The thing I find interesting about Post Hill is that letters, the Stronge used to have a country or a city house in Dublin. It's now the Parnell Art Gallery in Parnell Street. It's that lovely house at the top of Parnell Street with the curved walls. That was their city house in Dublin. They could write a letter from Dublin to the coachman to pick them up at the station the next morning. And we have a letter here that says, have the coach ready to pick me up at 10 o'clock tomorrow, which meant the letter could be written in Dublin and here the same day. And we go on about the internet and emails and Instagram. There were 4 collections, 4 deliveries every day. And we take a lot of that for granted. The written word was just effective in those days as an email is now. We're just lazy buggers. You might remember I mentioned the retreat from the Battle of Benburb, the military spur and a dragoon that was found in the crossing. This is the same farm, Cahill's farm. There used to be a wooden monastic settlement just the other side of Caledon. There were 7 Celtic crosses at the settlement. When the Vikings sacked it, the monks floated 2 of them off down the river, and they couldn't carry the rest. They didn't have the Weetabix. They left 5 of the crosses. They were falling into disrepair, so in 1847 they were moved to Tynan. 1 was moved to Caledon Estate, 3 were moved here. Like I was saying, 9th century, 1 is here. 1 is on the avenue that you drove up when you came in. That's where the GIs went for the last church service before they left for D-Day, and 1 is on the far side of the lake. Like I was saying to you earlier on, at the time that these were made, there were about 150 kings in Ireland. Each king would choose the design of his cross. It was like Pimp My Car. So every single cross was unique. The interesting thing about all the crosses around here, except for the Adam and Eve symbol up in Tynan, It was all, there was no religious symbols, just design on these particular ones. The base is supposed to represent Mount Golgotha that Jesus was crucified on, and you'll see that on most Celtic crosses. There's a cracking one in Castle Dermot, another one up in Donegal. The weird thing is, obviously this is one of the iconic symbols of Irish culture. There's only about 350 Celtic crosses in the country. We think there's thousands of them, but there are very few of them. And so, yeah, I just thought you'd be interested to see this. The yew trees, Sally was just asking me about the yews. These are Irish yews. They were discovered in 1750 over at Florence Court. I don't know how you just discover a tree that suddenly appears in 1750, but basically they've been used and are obviously synonymous with a lot of graveyards, etc. But it just gives you an indication of the age of the place. This was all pleasure grounds behind us, and beyond that is the remains of a pinetum. Round about the 1800s, the time of Joseph Paxton, after Capability Brown, a lot of this landscape was shunted around, a lot of woodland was moved. I came across an old diary excerpt from somebody who visited here at the Abbey, saying, oh, they've planted lots of laurel, verdant, lush green laurel. The laurel is now 30 foot high, invading the entire woodland, and we'll spend the rest of our lives removing it. Going back to the pinetum, it was a craze at the time to collect as many varied trees in an arboretum, or pines specifically. Paxton was at it in Chatsworth. He actually, and the Duke of Devonshire, sent a team to North America to try and get new specimens. That team were all drowned in a river. When specimens did arrive, Paxton used to go down to the station or to the port that had arrived, and he'd go back with it in his hat. He'd fill his hat with topsoil and put the plant, the small sapling, in his hat. Each one of a new variety is worth about £250,000 in today's money. It was a big deal at the time. I'm sure I'm going to come up with something else random to tell you in the next 5 minutes, but please make yourselves at home. Trees on the left, on the right, and beech trees on the left. The interesting thing here is there's two walled gardens. They're only an acre each. There's one there and one there. At one particular point in time, the gardens were producing more revenue than the estate was. All the leaves were collected up in the winter to create leaf mould. It was all sold up in Belfast. All the flowers that were grown here in the lily houses all went to Belfast. And they were a big cash cow. There were 18 gardeners working in the two gardens at one point in time. Now I have to do the work of 18.
And entertain the visitors.
And entertain the visitors. The pinetum, you can just see it's just down the far end there. We're just clearing away sycamore, ash, etc. You can see a Wellingtonia, that big tall tree sticking up there. And the pinetum went on down in the far direction. At the bottom of that hill, we're not going to walk there this evening. The Ulster Canal came through the estate. About a mile of the Ulster Canal came through here. I think it was James Stronge at the time was a major investor in the canal, which again, as you all know, was a bit of a disaster. It was too narrow, it leaked, the boats were the wrong size, and it finally closed down. I think it was 1950 odd. I was talking to a local farmer last year. His grandfather was employed with a horse to drag an anchor, a form of anchor, along the canal when it froze over to break the ice on the canal, which is an interesting little point. I will wander on down this way, just because I don't want to bring you past that. The grain loft, and as the pigeon loft was up here. So,
Yes, there's
that's the well, that's the well there, huh?
and that's your house, which was what? That's where you live.
We lived in the house that was
That was what?
that was the head gardener's house.
That's what you are.
Yeah. Cheap bottle washer.
Are you from here or from England?
I'm from everywhere.
He's a
Mirage. He's a mirage.
I'm a citizen of the world.
I'm saying that you know an awful lot of
Thank you.